Hello, everybody. Welcome to ITB Sunday School. My name is Jeff Koshin West. The date is June 7th, 2020. This is ITB Sunday School, and we're going to be chatting about something called bypassing. Got a couple of participants with us, and we may get some questions from them or some chat from them along the way. So primarily we're going to be getting into that. And of course, those of you that are witnessing this video on YouTube, please feel free to get in the comments into the chat and ask questions. And those questions we may answer directly online, or we'll make a whole darn Sunday school out of them if they are good questions. So always ask good questions. So today, like I said, our topic for today is bypassing. And we're going to talk about what bypassing is, where it comes from. It's very much kind of used in the kind of new age spiritual community and the personal transformation community. And it is kind of a big deal. It goes hand in hand with shadow work and remaining clean, clear, and curious in our world and in our life. And the other problem is that it's also pretty sneaky stuff, and it's oftentimes used in a not so good way. Just like anything in the world, it can be weaponized. And so we want to be really careful. One of the things we're going to pay attention to today is what bypassing is, what good things to do with it, and what not so good things to do with it. So we're just going to go ahead and jump on in and start talking about this stuff. So bypassing is a term that's come up probably in the past, maybe 15, 20 years. It's very much associated with the personal transformation community. Some of the first places that we saw it being talked about was in the term of spiritual bypassing. And there's a really great book by a gentleman by the name of Robert Augustus Masters, who wrote a book literally called Spiritual Bypassing. It is a brilliant book. It does have some, you do have to have some experience in the spiritual community to kind of see its value, because bypassing is oftentimes a very difficult thing to identify. Bypassing is a basic definition of bypassing is it's an automatic dismissal or avoidance of difficult or uncomfortable experience, emotions, sensations, concepts, different things like that. It is a way of having, essentially what happens is an emotion comes up and we say to ourselves that emotion doesn't feel good, or that thought doesn't feel good. And as that arises and we feel the discomfort and not so goodness of that thing that's arising, we say to ourselves, all right, let's kind of do something else or add something to this scenario to not feel uncomfortable, not to feel the uncomfortableness of the situation. So it's the use of an activity to swap one uncomfortable feeling for usually a good feeling. Now, it's not always a good feeling, but it's essentially the use of some activity, and it can be anything, innocent, sinister, it does not matter. It's an activity that you swap for not feeling the pain or discomfort of a certain thing. This happens like crazy, and there's a reason why this happens. The reason why this happens is because bypassing is closely linked to our coping mechanisms. Here is the real problem with this situation. Coping mechanisms are actually really important. We learn coping mechanisms from childhood. We learn coping mechanisms to deal with our humanity, essentially. What we're taught as children, we are we are culturized, we are taken care of, and we are taught right and wrong, good and bad, do's and don'ts, etiquette, essentially. And we're kind of indoctrinated into whatever community we're in. Indoctrination is perfectly appropriate and perfectly common. Indoctrination is only as bad as the people managing the indoctrination and the person that's experiencing it. So indoctrination is perfectly healthy when you set up etiquette and you set up a mode of being in culture, but you also leave the door open for more exploration. That's when indoctrination is perfectly normal and healthy and how it should be handled. Indoctrination is unhealthy when we get taught etiquette and then you beat people or kill people or ostracize people because they're outside of the etiquette norm. That means there's no door open to explore more. There's just, this is etiquette, and screw you and kill you and ostracize you and bully you if you don't sit firmly in that etiquette. That's where indoctrination is bad. Every child, meanwhile, back at the topic, Every child is basically taken through an etiquette process. They're taught right and wrong. Don't pee over there. These are the places where we pee. Don't eat your food like this. Don't grab toys from other people. Don't take food from other people. Treat people in XYZ way. So this is etiquette training. This is indoctrination. This is appropriate. We would have a really hard time with cultures if we didn't have some type of guidelines of culture and guidelines of caring and relating to each other. Very, very normal stuff. Happens all over the world in humans, but then also all kinds of other creatures. So coping mechanisms are ways for us to kind of deal with etiquette, deal with the impulsory nature of our childhood and our beginning human experience. So coping mechanisms are used to kind of train ourselves to focus on something. So as a child, if the child is very, very hungry, as the child ages and as the child is dealing with hunger, the child will create scenarios, and oftentimes these are mental ones, to remind them that they will get food at some point in time. So a child may feel great hunger, but may not act impulsively off that anger, off that hunger, by choosing to focus on, I will be fed in the next so-and-so hours. So the child kind of redirects its impulsive nature towards hunger into something that's manageable, and it copes with the hunger by telling itself and rationalizing to itself, investing in the fact that it will get fed by its guardian at some point in time. So this is a coping mechanism that's perfectly appropriate. The child may also do, if the child is experiencing anxiety, they may wrap themselves up into things. They may need to physically move. They may need to perform an activity in order to express that stress, or to process, or to express that stress, or to not be overwhelmed by that stress. These are all healthy coping mechanisms and need to be in place for the development of an identity. And this is where the big problem comes in, is that, like I said, coping mechanisms are good until they become kind of default, automated, and unquestioned behaviors. That big difference is where the problem comes in, because we do need to make sure we don't just impulsively act in reality. We need to become emotionally mature enough and socially mature enough to not constantly be impulsively running around doing anything. The word discipline, actually, to be disciplined, to be focused, to be driven, is actually a description of a person who has most likely a lot of functioning coping mechanisms to keep them focused on one thing, especially in a long-term type of a conversation. Most of us have a lot of short-term coping mechanisms. Oh, I have to eat right now, or I feel like some entertainment, or I feel like some water, or I feel like I need to shower, I feel like I need some human touch. We have ways in the short term to kind of deal with those things and insulate ourselves, and know that, and have coping mechanisms to make sure that we don't, burst into flames until we actually are able to meet that need. So coping mechanisms, like I said, aren't inherently bad. It's what happens with those coping mechanisms as we kind of evolve, and if those coping mechanisms turn into kind of thoughtless default orientations or automated performances, especially if they're automated and default orientations because of thoughtlessness, because we're not willing to reflect on these things. So a couple of examples of this are really tangible. One thing before I get into the examples here is that the problem with bypassing so very much is that bypassing looks like you're doing a good life. You could be doing a lot of bypassing activities. You can do a lot of bypassing activities and still be, in this culture, really functional, be identified as healthy, be identified as even successful and developed by some terms, by some standards. So bypassing is really, really, really wicked, insidious. It's very hard to catch, especially personally, just watching your own stuff or just looking at yourself. Bypassing is very, very sneaky, and it is a part of sometimes very, very, very innocent activities. And here's a really good example. So one of the examples that we often talk about, one of the easiest ways to point out bypassing is, let's say you're having a rough day and you're feeling a whole lot of anger. So you're feeling this anger, maybe you're not paying attention to it too much, maybe you're holding it and containing it and kind of pushing in different directions so you don't lose your shit and fly off the handle and maybe do something atrocious. So you're getting angry and or you have anger in your life, and let's say you get into your vehicle or you get home and you then turn on music to redirect your attention. You don't want to feel angry. You don't want to deal with the anger. What you want to do is feel better. So you put on some music or you put on some other type of entertainment that redirects you into another emotional territory. So I feel angry, but I put on this music to kind of push me into feeling happy or peaceful or excited or numb even, okay? Numbness is definitely an emotional experience. And we use numbness, we would rather feel numb than actually feel a lot of emotions in a lot of contexts. So this is a really typical example, really easily pointed out example of what bypassing is. And some people are like, well, shit, I do that all the time. What's so wrong with that? Technically, I mean, the wrongness is basically based off of the avoidance that you're doing. Do you ever actually deal with that anger? That is the real hang up. That is where the real trouble shows up, is that if you are angry, you get into your car, you put on some music, or you are home and you put on some television and entertainment of some form in order to quote unquote feel better or feel good or just not feel the anger anymore. This is an avoidance of what's alive inside of you. This is you're not being transparent with yourself, and we need to create some intimacy with that anger. And so that's where the kind of trouble comes in with bypassing. That's what the problem is that this can turn into just this automatic thing of thinking I'm doing the right thing, of redirecting my attention to a different emotion. Well, I think that's a good idea. But it's usually based off the idea that anger is wrong, and anger isn't wrong. Anger is, if anything, anger is just a twisted version of something else. And what we know and what we suggest in ITB and what a lot of other people in our tradition kind of point to is anger is a twisted version of something that you have deep care and concern about. And anger is 99% of the time based off of a perceived boundary violation. So if you feel angry, yeah, sure, anger doesn't feel good, but what your anger is telling you about is that there is some kind, your system has perceived some type of boundary violation. And you need to pay attention to that because the boundary violation was against something that you care about. So anger is truly deeply rooted in the untwisted version of anger is I care deeply for something that's not being cared for the way I think it ought to be cared for. That's what anger is. There's nothing wrong with anger. It's just if you're angry and then you beat people up, that's a problem, right? So there are no negative emotions fundamentally. What we do with those potent, twisted emotions is the actual negative side of things, is where we can judge it as good or bad or right or wrong. So when it comes to bypassing, this is where the big rub is that we define some emotion that arises. And usually it's the big uncomfortable ones, like the big three uncomfortable ones: anger, sadness, fear. Those arise. And what am I going to do? Oh, well, I don't want to feel those, God forbid. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to refocus into something else. All right. I want to refocus into some kind of entertainment that makes me feel whatever. Okay. And usually it's an emotion. We usually set this up as an emotion that's more preferable. So if I feel fear, I'm probably going to do some sort of bypassing activity to make me feel either calm, close to numb, or empowered. All right. Strong, not anything that's whatever you consider the opposite of fear to be. Okay. So if I feel these things come up, that's where bypassing is a problem, because these things are arising. Fear, sadness, and anger all have deep roots in some flavor of deep care and concern. They're heart-centered emotions that are just a little bit more sneaky and, confusing to a lot of people than other emotions. So this is why bypassing is the problem. This is what we hope to kind of unpack and kind of point to as a problem. So coping mechanisms aren't a problem. Coping mechanism that turned into default behavior, automatic behavior, thoughtless behavior, behavior that is just an unquestionable. This type of automatic, thoughtless kind of default behavior is where the problems show up, and that's where we want to start looking at some of these things. Bypassing is difficult to see exactly for this reason, because it's automatic behavior, it's default behavior. Bypassing is very difficult because, or it is a problem because it can dress itself up in really, really pleasant things. One major process for me that I had to discover along the way was I was meditating in order to bypass my emotions, to bypass the uncomfortable feelings for me. So where I come from in my lineage of meditation, I was taught that as many were, that certain emotions are bad and you shouldn't feel them. So anytime I felt angry, and anger was a big one for a very long time, angry and sad, what I would do is I would go and I would sit in meditation. And the way I was trained was that if I'm feeling sad or angry, I was trained that something was off in my heart chakra. And I needed to fix that. And if it wasn't the heart chakra, it was some other chakra that was upset, and I needed to fix and heal that sadness so I felt fine. And it's curious how I was trained. Fine meant numb. Calm meant numb. So I was trained that if I'm a spiritual person, I'm totally cool all the time. And that was a dangerous education from the people I was sitting with. Dangerous because if I'm a living human being, I'm constantly feeling different emotions, but I'm not, I'm constantly experiencing different emotions, the ebb and flow of life based off of reality and what's going on in existence. And I was not given enough education about why certain people who were identified as spiritual looked so chill and calm on a regular basis. They didn't explain what that meant and what was actually going on. So I identified being calm and spiritual as being numb and feeling nothing. So you can see where the rub comes in on this one, right? An emotion comes up. I identify good, healthy, spiritual Jeff as being calm and numb in this kind of, in the decoding of calm is numb. So I started moving into numbness. So I was good when I was numb. So any kind of emotion that came up, I would do my meditation and do whatever I did as far as visualizations and personal energy movement and even mantra work in order to feel numb and feel calm and feel good, right? So you could see why this could be a possible problem. There's a number of issues going on here. One, a really poor interpretation of what spiritual meant or what the end goal was in my spiritual practice. And then moreover, kind of a demonization of these certain emotions, and a lack of emotional education, emotional intelligence education, having to do with what was the true nature of emotions. That was the nature of things for a while. So I would meditate in order to make myself calm and numb and okay and a perfect human being and untethered to life. And so that was my meditation process. So meditation went well when I came out of meditation and I was calm and numb and feeling so much better, right? Able to go forwards in the world untethered to emotion. So this was a hang up for me. It was part of my maturation arc, part of a lot of people's maturation arc, but also something to outgrow, okay? So that's a wonderful way to kind of orient towards bypassing. Bypassing is one of those things where it's similar to shadow. Shadow is never going to be gone from you, okay? Your shadow material is always there. There's always life experience possibly adding to shadow, all right? And bypassing, since it's so closely connected to coping mechanisms, and you've had such a variety and juicy and dynamic life, and you are a juicy and powerful dynamic human being, that means bypassing can be in all kinds of different areas. So our relationship to shadow and bypassing is pretty similar. It's not a matter of getting rid of it or being done with it. It's more along the lines of, am I having a good relationship with it? Am I watching for it? Am I listening for it? And specifically with bypassing, can I outgrow bypassing? Can I put down default bypassing behavior? And can I actually pay attention to what's alive inside of me? We never want to be naive enough to think, oh, I'm done with that bypassing thing. That's not a good idea whatsoever. But we can work on a regular basis to outgrow bypassing behavior. Another way that we actively use bypassing is we supplement an activity for feeling. So I mentioned meditation before. It can be shopping, it can be sex, it can be creative activities, it can be doing an activity that makes you feel better, so to speak. So what we want to do is we don't want to just trash every behavior we have. What we want to do is we want to turn our curiosity towards, what do I do when I don't feel well? If I'm feeling angry, afraid, or sad, even numb or depressed or anxious, what do I do to get out of that? And the reason we ask that question is because we come from a place of, orienting that if emotions arise, it's telling us a story about our internal and external environment. All right. So if an emotion arises, we want to kind of hear what the emotion is about. We want to know what it's about and then act, instead of, oh, it's happening, let me go do this. So what we're wanting to do, it's a nuanced shift. We're wanting to pay attention and be raw and awake and curious about what's happening for us. And once we kind of get a feel of, oh, that's arising because of this, or oh, that's arising because of that, that's arising because of, oh, that's a good insight. We want to take that and then be like, all right, I now know why these emotions are arising. Now I can do something in relationship to that. And it's not whatever our action is then, after we kind of get a sense for what's alive inside of us, whatever action we take after understanding what's alive inside of us needs to be, or not needs, but ought to be directed towards clarifying misinterpretations that your body may be having, and then actions that will kind of support what's actually alive inside of you. So this is kind of a sticky thing. This does not happen very quickly. So those of you that may think, oh, I read a book on bypassing, I'm good. No, you're not. You've basically, when you read a book about bypassing or emotional intelligence, you've set some groundwork for it. And now you actually have to do the work of it. And the work of doing bypassing dismantling certain bypassing practices, this shit takes months, if not years and years of work. Okay, so it's similar to our orientation in ITB to shadow work. You're never done with it. You should be doing shadow work your whole life. You should be mindful of bypassing and how you bypass your whole life. So it's not really a question of, oh, I got that whole bypassing thing licked or that whole shadow thing licked. That's not appropriate relationship whatsoever. It's more along the lines of, I'm consistently working with this type of bypassing, and I'm consistently working to stay curious to when I bypass and how that looks. So far, we've kind of got this idea that bypassing comes from coping mechanisms. This is one of the ways that it is difficult to spot. Bypassing is based off of not really wanting to be awake and alive to what's inside of us. Bypassing is difficult to catch because it does live and is related to coping mechanisms. Bypassing is also difficult because it can take any quote unquote positive or beneficial activity and twist it in order to not feel what's alive inside of you. All right. This is so far the big trouble with it. So let's say you are doing a good job with this stuff. Let's say you are noticing some bypassing coming up. Maybe you've had a rough day at work, and really what you want to do is come home and eat a whole bunch of Oreos. I've totally been there. I've totally done that. So it happens. It's something to identify with. We have such delicious flavors in this world, of whether it be food or entertainment or drugs. We've got a lot of wonderful, delicious things in this world that are worthy of tasting. The problem is that if I am wanting to taste, if I'm going to have those Oreos and I'm going to quote unquote feel better from them, that's where the rub is. So instead of sitting with those emotions, I don't pay attention to them. I push them off to the side, and then I focus on Oreos. To kind of reverse this, or to kind of cut to the bypassing, the first step is to obviously pay attention to what's coming up for you. What do I actually feel? So maybe I feel angry. And so what we say in ITB is stay with it. That's one of our catchphrases in ITB. And stay with it is there specifically for these types of situations. Stay with the anger. If anything, if you can, open yourself to the anger even more. If you've been trained in some type of witness meditation, this is the time to hop in. Open your heart to allow and witness that anger in your heart and in your body, or let it into your whole system and give it its time and space to inform you about what it's experienced, what it's trying to let you know about. Remember earlier we said every emotion that arises is telling us a story about either our internal or external experience of reality. So that means that if I feel angry, there must be, my body, my system must be perceiving a problem. Must be, in this case with anger, it must be perceiving a boundary violation against something it cares about. So what we hope to do to start to dismantle bypassing is slow down, kind of, if we can, open ourselves to feeling whatever's arising, and then listening to, what am I actually angry about? What is there? What have I seen today? What have I participated in that reminds me of a violation of boundaries? Now, if you've noticed, if you turn on the television or even awake to the world, there are no shortages of things to be angry about, boundary violations. Holy shit, there's boundary violations happening on a regular basis of things, stuff, people, creatures that are constantly having their boundaries violated. So of course you feel angry. You would be inhuman if you didn't feel angry. You would be a wandering automaton if you didn't feel angry, because there's shit in your environment that you care about. That's clear. If you identify with something, if you call something, if you point to something and say, I care about that thing, and that thing has boundary violations put upon it, your response will be anger. So what we want to do is, first off, we have to kind of connect. We have to slow down a little bit, hold off on the Oreos in just a second. We don't have to get rid of the Oreos or demonize the Oreos, because fucking Oreos are Oreos. They're there. They're not good or bad. They're just there. So we got to stop that projection, okay? And we need to slow down and refocus on ourselves. And we got to refocus on, oh, I'm angry. And so let's just play the game. I don't know if I completely trust this Jeff guy, but let me just play the game and see what I find. And the game is, all right, what do I identify in my environment that I care about, that I believe has had its boundaries violated? And so if I sit with that question today, when did my anger come up? My anger came up when I saw this activity happening. And I say to myself, all right, was that an actual boundary violation of that thing, of that situation? And then we have to kind of unpack. This is where it can get sticky sometimes. We want to unpack, did I actually see a boundary violation? And was that boundary violation actually as bad as it actually was? Of course, all boundary violations are not awesome, but we have to understand something about boundaries. Boundary crossing is pretty inevitable. It's just how severe that shit gets. Okay, so if I walk into someone's household and say, how's everybody doing? And they're not doing well, they could perceive me just walking into that with a cheery mood as a boundary violation, because I didn't immediately notice they were in a sad place. They were in a bad mood, and they may perceive that I'm trying to manipulate their emotions because I'm checking in with everybody and I'm in a cheery mood. So this is how easy boundary violations and boundary issues can show up, poor perception, all that jazz. So we don't want to be naive enough to think, oh, I'm never going to cross a boundary again in my life just because I watched some stuff and I studied some shit and I did some therapy. That's an impossibility. You're going to violate some boundaries. You're going to cross some boundaries. But the reality is that we want to be as aware of boundaries as to minimize the severity of it. Okay, I'm going to say that again. We want to be aware of boundaries enough to minimize the severity. Okay, and minimizing the severity is very important. A person that is not paying attention to how severe their boundary violations are is a very dangerous human being. This is most likely a person who has a certain blankness as far as emotional intelligence. We can also say it's a person who has some blankness in regards to reading the room, reading a scenario, kind of decoding some deeper meanings. These days, this type of person would probably be identified as a person who has poor empathy skills. So a person who can't see, or maybe even informed about boundaries, but doesn't see how their actions could be major violations, this person is going to have to maybe reevaluate their ability to measure the severity. Maybe they may be educated in boundaries, but they're kind of dumb when it comes to what is severity model going on here. So we kind of want to be careful with that. Interpersonally though, if you feel emotions arising, you're angry about something, the next thing you want to do is you want to get clear that your body actually perceived what it perceived. Like I said, this can be a little bit sticky. You might have seen only part of the story of a situation that arose. If this situation happened to you, maybe you went to work and your boss yelled at you and that felt like a boundary violation to you. You're now angry about that because they didn't talk to you the way they ought to talk to you, how you believe they ought to talk to you. And you're angry because you care for yourself and you didn't like that sensation of being violated in that way and talked to that way. Perfectly appropriate response, by the way. You may have to evaluate that boundary a little bit more and consider what's going on with the boss. What should I expect from this human being as far as their communication skills, and how much pain tolerance am I open to? Put it in when you're measuring pain tolerance, another way of talking about it is how much shit I'm going to take from somebody. So we want to kind of measure some of those things, because what can sometimes happen is that there can be a boundary violation, and instead of just feeling the hurt from that actual interaction, your hurt of everyone that's ever talked to you that way hops on the back of that violation, and then boom. So some people call this a trigger, okay? So this is where the stickiness can come up, and this is how shadow work kind of plays hand in hand with bypassing. So I identify an experience, I realize, oh, I'm angry because my boss talked to me in a shitty way, and there was a boundary violation because I care about myself, I have self-worth. And then what insult to injury occurred, all my past damage about people talking to me in a shitty way got lumped on top of that. So once it's lopped on top, my ability to actually perceive the situation has just dropped. So I'm no longer angry with my boss anymore. The potentness of that anger is no longer just my boss. I've just thrown all that damage onto the situation with my boss. So this is a typical trigger situation. This is very, 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 very common. And the next worst thing that could possibly happen is that I'm going to make my boss pay for everyone else that's ever shit on me that way. So that's not fair to your boss. It's also not fair to you. It's not a healthy way to deal with triggers whatsoever. But we may kind of jump into that in another story about triggers in the future, because that's another big bit of information. Anyhow, if you're having this trigger, we have to kind of get clean about that. We have to be like, oh shit, I have that trigger coming up. I'm also noticing that I'm really angry about this current situation. And that's when you ought to probably jump into some of our shadow work that we suggest to you. That's prime time to do your shadow work, okay? And we have very specific ways of doing shadow work in ITB. That can be another video that you tune into at a different time. But that's time for doing that shadow work. So if you pay attention to your bypassing ways, it shows you, hey, this is a time for dealing with shadow work. And this is also something, another way. Then I have other techniques to deal with this bypassing thing. So then if it's time for shadow work, sit down and do shadow work. And that's how you can dismantle that bypassing experience. Just by slowing down and sitting with that emotional experience and then identifying, was it a true boundary violation that I really need to spend this much time being angry about? Can I just give myself permission to be angry about that one incident and then move on with my life? Or am I having the experience of that one incident and then bringing in all this other material? That's time to sit down and do shadow work. Not have Oreos, but sit down and do your shadow work and do your work with that. And maybe go, and this is also, by the way, this is also the kind of material you want to bring to your counselor, your therapist, your coach, whatever it is, your ITB steward. This is the type of material you want to take to them because they are trained with skills to support your investigation of that material. All right. So don't take that shit to a friend. Don't call up your friend and unload on your friend about how shitty your boss is. This is not for your friend, okay? This is for someone who's a trained professional, because your friend can just like fan those flames, be like, oh yeah, totally that. Or even worse, they'll dismiss you. They'll say, oh, you didn't see that right. Oh, you totally misinterpret this. Oh, you're so sensitive. So friendships are great. Friendships are not trained psychotherapists. Friends are not trained psychotherapists or counselors or support teams or coaches to help you deal with this stuff, okay? So take that shadow material to somebody that's trained for it. Your parents aren't trained for it. Your romantic partner is not trained for it. Your friends are not trained for it. Take it to people who are trained for it, okay? Do those people you say you love and care about, do them a favor and do not unload that shit onto them and expect them to have the education and skill sets to support you, because they just won't, okay? It's real roll the dice, and who the hell knows what's going on with them. Anywho, when you identify this bypassing thing, let's play the other route. This thing comes up, you identify why you're having this experience, this emotion. If you're not bringing all this other material to that event, if it's just that event coming up for you, what we suggest is express whatever emotion that is. If you have deep care and concern about something, speak about it, how you care about it. And another way to kind of approach this, to deal with this sensation inside, is take the time to speak what is true for you as if the person that violated you or participated in the violation was in front of you. So this is pretend, but it actually is therapeutically valuable. This actually helps us get out of the situation, helps us move on from it. And so if that stuff comes up, speak about what you care about, say why you care about it, say how you think it ought to be treated, and say what you perceived was the problem or the boundary violation, and pretend that person's in the room. So in this instance, if that's a boss, imagine that boss is in your room or in some place in your territory, and rage at them if you need to rage. You can speak clearly, you can move into rage, you can have a tantrum, you can say rude things to them if you feel if that feels appropriate. And you can spend some time getting that material up and out, all right? Up and out, or out of your system, letting it be spoken makes a change for the identity, makes a change for the nervous system and for the biochemistry. If you want to go even farther, take some time to imagine a positive outcome. Let's say you're having this argument and you're stating this truth to this individual, this boss. Imagine this boss receiving that and hearing it and apologizing. Now, I know you may be saying to yourself, well, this is all happening in the imagination world. What about my dealings with this actual boss? That's a little bit of a bigger story. But what we're hoping to do is be responsible in this instance, in this practice that we're pointing to. This puts responsibility into your hands about how you are going to carry this experience. How you are going to be possessed, or how you're going to be conscious about this experience. So this is the work you need to do in this moment as we go forward, as we have this life. What you do with that future relationship, once again, bring this to your counselor, bring this to the people that are supportive of your coaches, your counselors, your ITB steward educators. We are the ones that can definitely support this process. That's kind of for another video beyond just this. So this is how bypassing and shadow are deeply related to each other. Both of them have really strong flavors and smells having to do with denial. Bypassing performs denial by focusing on something else. By the way, after you do a lot of that internal turning towards what's alive inside of you, your ass can still have some Oreos. It's just that you'll be having Oreos as a conscious being, not having Oreos in trying to make yourself feel better. You'll actually be able to enjoy that thing more and make a conscious choice if you actually need to have those Oreos. Having 2 Oreos may be good from this mindset, whereas you might have had the whole package from the bypassing mindset. So I don't know about you, but it usually takes a lot of entertainment and a whole lot of flavors in order to get me to move out of some of my really strong emotional experiences. So this is stuff that we don't want to participate in. We want to shine the light of awareness onto what we're feeling and experiencing. And from there, that really decreases the power of bypassing. That really takes you actually out of bypassing and moves you back into some conscious awareness and conscious functionality as a human being. Once again, whatever you're using as your bypassing material or your bypassing practice, that thing actually most likely isn't horrible. Now, some of them are horrible. Narcotics, drugs, addiction type activities that stuff's dangerous. But if you're using, like I mentioned before, Oreos aren't inherently dangerous. Entertainment isn't inherently dangerous. Meditation isn't dangerous. Prayer isn't meditation. Worship, enjoyment, spending time with friends and different things like that are not dangerous, but you can use those things to bypass, to deny what's alive inside of you. And from the world of ITB, our primary focus is be awake to whatever is alive inside of you. Be awake to it. Make time to be awake to it. And in a serious, dangerous, or scary, or high energy situation where you can't be aware of all of that stuff, and you have to focus on just getting something done, later on, once that thing is done, then you make space for feeling those things. And this is how we suggest you proceed with your bypassing practice. So a little bit of a recap. Bypassing is any kind of automatic or default activity that you do in order to not feel what's alive inside of you. In order to kind of slow down and or stop, to slow down or mature out of the bypassing default mode, we want to slow down. We want to kind of focus on what I feel, what's alive inside of me. We want to apply some model of translating what emotions are telling us about. If you're wanting to read more about translating emotions, I very much point to the work of Robert Augustus Masters, of Marshall Rosenberg in Nonviolent Communication, of the Mondo Zen tradition. So these are ways I implore you to practice some sort of decoding of emotions and what emotions might be telling you about. So you slow down, you stay with the emotions, you sit with the emotions. At that point in time, while you're sitting with that stuff, you have to make a choice and kind of attempt to discern, am I lumping a lot more baggage onto this scenario, or am I really clean that I'm just upset by this scenario? So if I'm clumping things on, if I'm adding more baggage from the past experiences onto this scenario that just happened to me, and then at that point in time, I need to slow down even more, and I need to spend some time maybe doing some shadow work, okay? Or bringing that material to my counselor or my therapist or my team of healers. If the baggage is not lumped onto it at that point in time, sitting with that experience, sitting with those things, maybe speaking and doing some imagination activities in order to kind of speak and share and rage the way you need to, and ask for your needs to be met in a certain way, ask for certain behavior, and imagine that person who possibly agitated you, or those people or this group or a certain thing that's agitated you, kind of imagine that healing or changing or an apology or behavior shift, imagining that happen to kind of remind you of what should be expected, how the relationship should proceed, and then moving on with your day however you see fit to do such thing. Okay, so that's our usual model about how to do that stuff, and this is how we present bypassing and how we talk about bypassing in ITB. Another thing to remember lastly about bypassing is that Similar to shadow work, bypassing, we never want to be naive enough to think that we're done with shadow work or we're done with paying attention for bypassing. We want to consistently pay attention to those things and always leave the door open, generously open, for the fact that we are messy creatures. Perception is messy by nature, and that we need to be careful and awake to and carry gently the idea that we're always right or that we're always going to have the correct interpretation of things. And so, and we always want to leave room for our interpretation having a certain amount of truth, maybe not the whole truth. So we want to be mindful that shadow work and bypassing is an ongoing full life experience. There's no end to it. There's no completion. We human beings are constantly evolving, which means there's no end to the shadow work or bypassing work. That the bypassing activity isn't inherently bad, and it is still okay to do that thing as long as it's not coming from a place of a bypassing nature. As long as we're not doing that thing based off of bypassing something. We also want to keep in mind that there's a lot more work. Once we start identifying shadow and bypassing material, there's a lot more work to do outside of that. It's not enough to just identify that you're bypassing and that there may be some shadow material. That's great, but that's just the first steps. The next steps is behavior modification, dismantling perceptions, dismantling perceptual orientations, updating your philosophical orientation, doing meditation and anchoring more into just awareness, just the observer, just the witness. These are all things that have to continue on. So it's to just say, oh, I'm such a great person, I'm super spiritual because I've identified how I bypass, or I learned about some bypassing, I took a workshop, I watched some Sunday school stuff, I read a book. That's like the most half-assed version of doing shadow work or dealing with your bypassing problems. The real work is, once you've identified where you're doing that, is then dismantling it and actually changing behavior and modifying philosophical orientations and doing the mature practice of meditating into just awareness, just observer, just witness. So that's kind of the storyline, what we wanted to present as far as bypassing is concerned, and why it is just an essential practice for us to be doing on a regular basis if we claim to be wanting to mature, if we claim that we're a person that is into personal transformation, if we claim to be a person who wants to be enlightened or wants to evolve or wants to be whole and healed. This is the kind of work that in our ITB tradition, this is the kind of work that we have found to be of the utmost importance. So if you're down with that, come and join us, man. That's what we're all about here at ITB. That's our regular practice. That's our regular story. And so if you need support, get it. It's so difficult to do this stuff on your own. So make us, if you want, make us part of your team. And if it's not us, get somebody else. Please get a team, because this shit, doing it on your own is extremely difficult. And you will most likely miss the most important shadow and bypassing practices because they're so default, because they're so normal. You call them just how you are. So please get a team, please participate, hop on with us. Per usual, we're here every Sunday at noon doing Sunday school for this, and that's exactly what Sunday school is about, creating education and solidarity and community for this stuff. Join us for Mondo Monday, every Monday from 6 p.m. Eastern time, and join us for this stuff, and join us for this meditation practice and conversation and community, so you actually can mature, and so we can actually evolve, so we can actually decrease the suffering of our planet. So that's why we're here, and that's why we invite you to participate. So I'm deeply, deeply grateful for your participation. I'm glad you checked this video out. I know these videos are always long, but this shit is not simple. You can't have this conversation in 5 minutes, I'm afraid. You can't do this deeper work in a quick 5-minute presentation. This should be understood, that when we do this work and we do these long conversations, it's because there's nuances here that you cannot cover in 5, 10-minute, 15-minute increments. It means you have to slow your ass down and pay attention to the details of how you perceive in order to unpack how shitty you are at perceiving. And we have to come to terms with how shitty we are at perceiving in order to wake up to actually have better perceptual skills, better communication skills, better listening skills, better interaction skills, better modes of being on this planet, better relationships. So we wish you well. You know where to find us. We love you dearly. I wish you good rest. I wish you happiness and health, and plenty of fabulous insights in your world.